So I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Aimee Murphy from Rehumanize International.
Thanks for your patience, everyone. I am really glad to be here. If y'all can just turn off the projector, because right now it's just blue light shining in my eyes for no reason. So no need for that, really. Yeah, figure it out. Cool. Great. So Maddie invited me out tonight to talk about how we can work to end rape culture while still upholding human dignity, and particularly the relationship between rape culture and abortion in our modern world. So at first, I was honestly, I had a little trepidation because I knew that doing this talk would mean telling part of my story. And usually, I'll give a little smidgen at the beginning of every talk. It's really brief, it's a summary, and it's not a big deal. Tonight, I'm going to be delving into my story a little bit more. So just be prepared. It's going to be a little long, but it's a story worth hearing. So we are a consistent life ethic organization at Rehumanize International. Our whole shtick is basically we seek to end all forms of aggressive violence against human beings. Both the preborn, but also the elderly, from sexual assault survivors to those who are trafficked to those who are bombed behind enemy lines. So we have a whole docket of topics that we try to address because we understand that the reason why human beings are valuable, the whole reason why preborn children are worthy of protection, is because we share this inherent human dignity as members of our human family. So to begin, I want to talk a little bit about why I accepted Maddie's offer to speak to you today, despite how difficult it is for me to really talk about these issues. I was actually talking about this with my therapist this morning. She was like, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about breaking open your story for a room full of strangers? And I was like, I'm a little nervous because being vulnerable means that I am trusting you all to have a sort of reverence for what I'm going to share with you. So she said, you need to make sure that you are making clear why it is important to you to end rape culture, why it's important to you that you give this talk. So I want to create a world without violence, right? It seems common sense. It seems like the easiest thing in the world. It seems like everyone should be on board. Unfortunately, we know that's not the case. So I want to create a world without rape, without sexual assault, or predatory behaviors. After experiencing all of the pain and suffering that comes with being a survivor of sexual assault, I want to do my utmost to create a culture where no one else has to go through this pain. I want to be able to tell others who have endured this crime that they are not alone. So when I tell my story today, I'm not looking for your pity. This is not a victim moment. I am a survivor. But not everyone has made the journey that I have from victim to survivor. So if you haven't had the great blessing of having a wonderful therapist like I have, but you're in a similar boat, I just want to lay it out at the beginning. If rape and sexual assault are difficult for you to hear about, I will not be offended if at any point you have to leave, to take a breather, to kind of step away for a minute. This talk wasn't easy for me to write, and I respect that it's probably also not going to be easy for people to hear. So to those of you who are here who are not survivors of this kind of trauma, I'm going to give you the first piece of advice in my presentation. Part of competently walking with survivors is giving us the space and time that we need to grieve and process in our own way. So be there for us when we're ready to talk, but don't make us talk. So where do I begin? Because it all seems so heavy, right? And when I was in college, I hadn't dealt with it yet. I didn't start dealing with it till I had graduated and was engaged and dealing with preparing for marriage. I can't totally explain why sexual violence seems to hurt us more deeply and more lastingly than other types of violence often do. I can only say that I have found it to be true for me. I don't think it's a mere consequence of purity culture or religious belief. I think there's something physiologically in the act itself. Sexual intimacy releases oxytocin into our systems. Anyone here ever heard of that magnificent chemical? It's often called the love hormone. It's a chemical that binds human beings using, specific chemical reactions that act like opiates in our brain, that bind us to other human beings, even to dogs and cats. That's actually like a pretty cool thing that happens, like cross-species oxytocin release. But for tonight, I'm going to be talking about that human situation. So it's meant to solidify profoundly lasting bonds, right? And it's released during sexual intimacy of any kind, and even during sexual violence. When a violence occurs to us in a sexual context, it can confound the connections in our brains, crossing the wires and twining simultaneous bond with simultaneous trauma. An act biologically meant for intimacy, for connection, for commitment, for love, becomes a trigger for trauma and often indescribable pain. My presentation slide here would have said something about looking up the relationship between oxytocin release and trauma. There's like psychological studies that have been done, and it's really fascinating, and it helps explain the trauma response for a lot of survivors. So I can try to find the link afterwards if you're curious. I've heard it said by some acquaintances and friends that we do not have a rape culture here in the United States because it's worse in other places around the world. Like, my brother-in-law said this to me once, and I was like, oh, really? Literally every girl that you have interacted with on this comment thread is a survivor of sexual violence. He didn't know that, of course, but... So when I heard this, I was honestly taken aback. I was raped as a teen, but I have survived many other acts of sexual violence in my short 30-year lifetime. Sometimes the violence was perpetrated by strangers, sometimes by people that I loved dearly. If you don't think that rape culture exists in our nation, I encourage you to sit down with a humble heart and a group of your female friends. According to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, in the U.S., 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience some form of contact sexual violence in their lifetime. In light of the statistic, it's extremely likely that someone that you know and love has suffered or will suffer some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. The story I'm about to tell is distinctly my own. But I'm sadly quite sure that there are dozens more stories carried in shame and silence by the people in this room. So we begin in compassion, with heavy hearts, eager to change the culture and the world. I grew up in California, the granddaughter of Mexican immigrants on my father's side, and a World War II vet and a pro-life nurse on the other. I was the firstborn daughter of 2 very dedicated and driven parents who sacrificed a lot to give me a very privileged life. Seeing that I grew up in California and had a working mother, it of course made sense that I adopted feminism as a youngster. It was sort of just a given in our culture, too. If you cared about humanity, you were probably liberal, and you were probably also a feminist, which meant you were probably also pro-choice. I became a social justice warrior at a pretty young age. Dystopian literature was my favorite genre by the time I was 11 years old, and The Diary of Anne Frank was the best book in all of history if you had ever asked me at that age. As I hit middle school, my parents regrettably still had not had the talk with me, so, admittedly they never did. Awkward, but the truth. It's a symptom of our puritanical culture that seeped over even into Catholic communities in the United States and into my upbringing. So at 11, 12, and 13, I learned about sex from my peers. I learned about procreation and relationships and abortion from my peers. I learned very little about my budding sexuality in the context of sexual orientation. All I knew was that I was attracted to girls too. Oh, and of course, I also learned about abortion and all that came along with that from my peers. As I said, I was a teenage feminist, so when my peers told me that in order to be an authentic feminist, I had to embrace abortion, I was like, yeah, sure, cool, whatever. I didn't really think too much about it. I just kind of accepted it as gospel truth. At 14, I started a very quick series of relationships with both guys and girls, trying rapidly and with little direction to sort out my feelings and my sexual orientation and what was right and wrong in terms of relationships. I opted to leave behind the Catholic faith and morals that my parents had vaguely tried to teach me in my younger years without really conveying it through words. And I declared myself an atheist at 14. I was that person that countless anti-abortion celebrities have railed against in the past. Liberal, atheist, queer, and feminist. So I suppose it came as a sort of a surprise to my peers and even to myself when my position on a woman's right to choose withered away within the space of a few terrifyingly long days in my sophomore year of high school. So try to imagine me at 15 years old. Up here I had a very stylish picture of me in my band uniform. It was wind ensemble. Yeah, great photo. So you can imagine, I was about the same height, didn't have any cool hair, didn't have any cool tattoos. I was far more nerdy, had braces, etc. You get the picture, right? I didn't really feel like I fit in anywhere because I was simultaneously a jock on the JV basketball team as a freshman, but also going to all-state honor band by my junior year in high school. So I was in this weird sort of liminal space where I didn't feel like I belonged. But as human beings, I think we all sort of come from this place of desiring acceptance and affirmation and belonging. And I craved that. So when one of the guys in my circle of band geeks started flirting with me, I practically fell over myself, tripping to make him love me. He would hold his love, affection, and commitment hostage. And the price? It was sex. I knew that I was running a risk getting sexually active with him at just 15 years old. Not only was I risking sexually transmitted infections and the possibility of pregnancy, there was also the distinct probability that if anyone found out about our intimate affairs, that he would be praised and seen as more attractive, and I would be shamed and called a slut. Still, I craved love and affirmation, so I was willing to risk all of those things for his attention. I turned 16 and he turned 17. It was January and we'd been sleeping together for several months in an on-again, off-again boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. He cheated on me, then we got back together. Then I told him that I wasn't comfortable having sex anymore and he broke up with me. So it's kind of obvious what he was after. Looking back, I can see that there was something that didn't sit quite right about our relationship. I can see how he was using me. His blatant objectification of my body became even more obvious when February rolled around. Yeah, hindsight is always 20/20, but even at 16, I could see that he just wanted me for sex. I was hurt, but we stayed friends. Because again, I craved affirmation, I craved affection, I craved love. In my own immature way, I loved him. So when he called me up on Valentine's Day, just a few weeks later, I answered, sort of begrudgingly. He was crying on the other end of the line, sobbing about how lonely he was while he was delivering flowers for a family friend's small business. Part of me wanted to respond, that sounds like your problem. Sounds like your mistake. You are the one that broke up with me. You do remember that, right? But in the end, I caved and told him that if he wanted to come over, we could sit and talk on my front porch. My parents weren't home, and I knew my parents' rule that guys weren't allowed in the house. He arrived and parked in the driveway. I stood up as I heard his door slam and my low blood pressure struck, something I still have to this day. Everything went white, and the next thing I knew, he raced up the walk and threw himself at me. The rest is sort of a blur, to be honest, between the fact that I whited out and couldn't see, and my brain just sort of dissociated. I knew he unzipped my pants and he forced himself on me, but I froze. I dissociated, and my brain couldn't comprehend the trauma of the rape. The violence of someone that I loved using my body as an object. Most of what I remember is pushing against him feebly, just saying no over and over again. Felt like chunky sobs that felt like I had a bitter pill stuck in my throat and I couldn't get it out. Thank God, eventually a car drove by, and I think it scared him, and he stopped. The next thing I remember, he was gone. After that, he and I didn't talk anymore, for obvious reasons. Our friendship was over, as far as I was concerned. I tried telling a few of my friends about what happened in an effort to warn them away from his flirtations. They didn't believe me. They sided with him, calling me a slut and a whore. Our friends group was torn in two, except it wasn't an even split. It was me and one of my best friends and everyone else. So I had the one friend who stood by me, but I honestly, to this day, don't know if she really ever believed me. But she loved me enough to stand by me. Everyone else stood by him, unbelieving me, alienating me, tormenting me by their judgmental stares and their abandonment. Honestly, their disbelief compounded the doubt that I had in myself. What if I had been asking for it? What if by allowing him to come over, I'd been saying, yeah, this is what I want? I blamed myself for putting myself into such a vulnerable situation, for having been interested in him romantically in the first place when I met him my freshman year. Because I'd been raped by someone that I loved, by someone I'd been dating on again, off again, I worried that I wouldn't be believed by my parents or teachers or the police, so I didn't report. Heck, my parents didn't find out that I had been raped until I gave a talk about the consistent life ethic at the parish I grew up at when I was 24 years old. My mom was crying in the front pew. So back to me at 16. March came in like a lion and didn't go out like a lamb as I'd hoped. I remember it was really rainy that year and the weather matched my mood. I'd lost all of my friends. I'd lost the sense of belonging that I somehow had cobbled together over my freshman and sophomore year. I lost my sense of dignity as I wandered around my high school really aimless and friendless. But I also feared that I'd gain something too, or rather, someone. Early April arrived, so it was about 14 years ago, about now. I hadn't had a period since before February. I was nauseous a lot. I was putting on weight, and I was waiting anxiously for Aunt Flo to arrive on my doorstep. The only thing that ran through my mind constantly was, what if I am pregnant? What if I'm pregnant by my rapist? Then and there, the only thing that kept running through my mind was, I have to have an abortion. I was 16 years old. I was the top of my class. I was a straight-A student. A lot of my teachers said that I was slated for an Ivy League school. So I was worried that I had really messed up my future. But nearly half a year earlier, before the guy had raped me, we had a conversation. We had said that if we got pregnant, that we would raise the child together. And yet, I was suddenly now in this new situation where we weren't talking and we weren't going to be, for good reason, for my own safety. Suddenly, all of my fears were laying so heavy on my shoulders. And like someone had just set a massive dumbbell on my chest. I didn't feel like I could breathe. I couldn't tell my parents for fear of judgment, for fear that they would tell me that it was my own fault. So I told my only friend who would listen, the only one who stood by me. But she was pro-choice, so her response was, yeah, if you think it's right for you, you should have an abortion. I remember Planned Parenthood being tossed around during our conversations. I was cold and lifeless, frozen like a zombie, fixated on a singular goal. Only I didn't want to eat brains, I wanted an abortion. I was consumed by the idea that having a baby would absolutely destroy all of the hard work that I had thrown in over the years, because my parents told me when I was 10 years old that if I didn't get a full tuition scholarship to college, I wasn't going. It would all be for naught if I had a child. Abortion seemed like the only choice that I had, especially because I didn't want to be tied to my rapist for the rest of my life. So I talked at length with that one friend, and somehow word spread from her to the guy that I thought I was pregnant. So one day I'm sitting in my drafting class working on some project or other. It was probably for the state fair. And he comes into my class and pulls me out, asks the teacher, like, hey, can I talk to Aimee? The teacher knew him too, because earlier in the year I had convinced him that he should take drafting. So we go out to the hallway, and I'm furious at him, and I'm like, what? What do you want? And he says, Aimee, you need to get an abortion. I will drive you, I will pay for it, but you need to get it taken care of. And I just sort of stood there like, what right do you think you have? So I asked him, why is this important to you? Why does it matter? And he said, well, I just don't want my mom to find out about what happened. I laughed, but my jaw just sort of hung open, like, I cannot believe you right now. And he said, Aimee, if you don't get an abortion, I might kill you. And then myself. And I told him, you need to leave. Go. Now. I went back to my class. My world felt like it was spinning. My stomach felt like it was doing cartwheels. I was already nauseous as it was, and I went and sat back down at my computer station. I had knots in my stomach, and if I had had the presence of mind, I would have gone to the teacher or the principal or my parents or the police, but I didn't tell anyone. I was just so terrified about what he was going to do to me. He clearly didn't care about me, about my dignity. He disregarded my lack of consent when it came to sex, and now he was threatening to kill me. And yet something else clicked in that moment too. I knew that if I was indeed pregnant, that the child within me would be worthy of the same respect and care that I was deserving of. I knew that I couldn't be like him. That what he was telling me was, you're an inconvenience to me, and you're an inconvenience to my future. Therefore, I'm going to kill you. And I knew I couldn't say that same exact thing to an innocent, defenseless human being. I had just taken 9th grade biology, right? Like, I knew what happened when sperm and oocyte fuse at conception. I was well aware. I think I just didn't care up until that moment. Up until I had that moment of connection where I understood that both of us were being threatened with violence at the same exact time. I sat quietly and solemnly, pondering what this revelation meant for my future. What right did I have to inflict the same harm that was being threatened against me, against another? How much better would I be than my rapist if I chose the path of violence to get what I wanted in life? Honestly, it was because of the feminism that I had already adopted years before that I realized I could not use oppression to seek my own liberation and success as a woman. So in the moment when my own life was threatened, I adopted a philosophy of nonviolence. In the moment when my own life was threatened, I knew more than ever that I must live my feminist principles. In the moment when my own life was threatened, after having suffered rape and sexual violence, I knew that I had to do something to stop all violence, including the violence of abortion. So I want to open up this larger conversation around how we end rape culture with a bare bones discussion of consent. It should have seemed pretty obvious to y'all that the guy who raped me didn't ask consent, nor did he respect my no. I've experienced several other instances of sexual violence, including sexual assault, harassment, and the psychological assault of being masturbated at in public. None of those men ever asked my consent. And each time when I froze up and started to cry and whisper, no, 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 they did not respect my right to live free from violence. They never asked permission and used sex to get power over me. I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard the phrase, but like, rape is not about sex, it's about power. Remember that as we go forward. So what defines rape? According to the Justice Department, rape is the penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. The key word there is consent. Consent is the bare minimum. Consent is the thing that makes the sexual act not an act of violence. And we need to teach our entire culture the necessity of consent. The practice begins young. So maybe y'all don't have children right now. Maybe you do. I don't know. Your life. But think about for the future, if and when you do end up raising children. So how do we teach our children that their bodies are their own? Do we ask for hugs or high fives or kisses or other forms of affection? And when we ask, do we leave room for them to say no? I know there are some adults, my parents included, and some of my uncles and aunts, who, told their kids, you need to go hug, your Aunt Joan or your Uncle Ted or Grandma or Grandpa. No. Like, you may have been forced to do that. Please do not pass that on to your children. I can speak from firsthand experience that being told those things gave me the impression that my body was not my own and that other people had a right to it. So, asking for personal contact, giving the room to say no are really crucial. There are things that you can teach children without needing to talk about sex. Just be like, hey, can I give you a high five? And if the kid's reserved and holding back, you be like, you can say no. You have a right to say no. And I'll do that with my friends' kids to this day. Leave room for that. So I cannot reiterate it enough times. Do not force children to give hugs or any form of physical affection to others, because it subtly, implicitly sends the message to the child that their body is not their own. When children know that their bodies are their own, when they are confident in the dignity that they have as members of the human family, they are more well situated to speak out against such violence and to be the best advocates for themselves and their dignity. So start talking about consent in an age-appropriate manner to the children who are in your life. By the time most young adults hit college, they are likely aware of the realities of sexual activity among their peers. But how do we create a culture on college campuses that affirms human dignity and rejects rape culture? It begins with affirmative consent. According to the organization End Rape on Campus, the affirmative consent in a sexual context constitutes the following. Affirmative consent is a knowing, voluntary, and mutual decision among all participants to engage in sexual activity. Consent can be given by words or actions as long as those words or actions create clear permission regarding willingness to engage in sexual activity. Silence or lack of resistance in and of itself does not demonstrate consent. The definition of consent does not vary based on a participant's sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Talk to your partner before, during, and after all sexual activity. Establish, check in with, and respect everyone's boundaries. Affirmative consent is mutual, communicative, enthusiastic, continuous, and necessary. It's worth mentioning again that consent is a bare minimum. Consent just makes this sexual act not a grievous act of violence. Many religious and ideological backgrounds have more guidelines for what might make a sexual act good or holy or proper. But regardless of what faith background you come from, consent education, again, is that bare minimum. We should be teaching our Catholic kids when they are young about affirmative consent, about the right to say no. So consent education is key. But what else do we need to acknowledge and address in our society in order to end rape culture? We need to end objectification, toxic masculinity, date rape, victim blaming, and the unbelief in survivors. We need to understand trauma responses, reporting and conviction rates, and the human-centered response to rape conception. This is all going to be heavy, but it's a much-needed conversation in this day and age. So one thing about continuing with sexual activity despite a lack of consent is that it is blatantly objectifying. So I'm sure you guys all saw this in my story, right? My rapist very clearly saw me as a vessel for his pleasure. He did not respect my right to say no. He did not respect my own bodily integrity. He lost view of my full humanity and through his actions participated in my dehumanization. The other men who violated my mind and my body in sexual violence treated me the same way, not as a full human being deserving of protections and rights and dignity, but as an object of their sexual fulfillment. This is common in our rape culture. The objectification of women, gender nonconforming, and transgender people happens all the time. Objectification is inherently dehumanizing. It treats a human being as an object, as a mere means to an end. This is contrary to the consistent life ethic because, as the agnostic personalist philosopher Immanuel Kant said, the human being, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in himself, not merely as a means to be used by this or that will at its discretion. Instead, he must, in all actions, whether directed to himself or also to other rational beings, always be regarded at the same time as an end. What that means basically is don't treat people like things. So how do we reject objectification in our day-to-day lives? Consider what you say, for starters. So maybe you've heard phrases from your friends or from movies, things like, I'd like a piece of that, or that is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. I remember seeing that in a movie trailer and thinking immediately, oh my gosh, that's so objectifying. It's so dehumanizing. This objectification extends beyond sexualization, though. Dehumanization and treating humans like objects precipitates violence across the board. So consider your truly bad words, those that dehumanize. Stop calling transgender and preborn humans it. I'm not sure if you heard it in my story, but my rapist very clearly said, you need to get it taken care of. That's common. I think often people presume we don't know the gender of the baby, so we're just going to call it it. Please don't call a human a thing. Please use the first person plural. That's fine. Other things to look out for. Don't call immigrants and refugees illegals. Call out your peers when they refer to incarcerated people and the disabled as parasites on the system. And rejecting objectification starts at a young age. So teach children, those you come in contact with, those you might raise someday, that everyone has a name, is worthy of dignity, and shares that dignity because of our shared humanity. If we begin teaching our children about consent and rejecting objectification at a young age, then perhaps we can also do some great good by teaching our boys to reject toxic masculinity. Now, some of you may have bristled at that term. There are some people that I talk to that think that I mean that all masculinity is toxic. That's not what I'm saying. What it means is that there is a specific version of masculinity that is toxic, that is harmful. So you may have heard a Spanish term for this, which I think some people are more comfortable with. It's machismo. And not only is this toxic masculinity harmful to girls and women, it's also extremely harmful to boys and young men. Terry Coopers, a highly renowned psychiatrist and an expert in the field of psychological health of incarcerated men, has been credited with one of the more influential definitions of toxic masculinity, which is the constellation of socially regressive male traits that serve to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia, and wanton violence. Within our society, toxic masculinity spreads all the way to our children's development. But we have the power to reject the status quo or accept it. We can build up wholesome masculinity, or we can push it aside. Currently, so many male children are subtly socialized to think that not communicating is fine, that emotions are something to be ashamed of, that consent isn't necessary, and that if their partners are quiet, that silence is consent. Oh, and that even if it is violence, not getting consent and rape and stuff, that violence is okay. Boys and girls are subliminally conditioned to believe in patriarchal constructs around sex. If a man has sex, it's brag-worthy, right? But if a woman does, she's shamed. She's called a slut and a whore. Her value is decreased, while the man's value is suddenly through the roof. I can't tell you how many girls went after the guy who raped me after they found out that he'd been sleeping with me. They were unwilling to see that he had done violence, unwilling to accept that. Because his sexual value went through the roof while I lost all my friends. All of this gets at something that I struggle with even to this day. Sometimes I wonder, truly and honestly, if he even recognizes that what he did to me was rape. Heck, I didn't even come to terms with it fully until probably 7 years ago, because of really phenomenal therapists who helped walk me through my trauma. This is because of several reasons. Number one, my trauma response made everything more complicated in my brain. And number two, I was raped by an intimate partner. The main thing that contributed to my own personal hell of disbelief was my trauma response. Most people know the terms from some past science class or other, usually about, like an animal in the face of danger. You familiar with the terms fight, flight, and freeze? I had only learned about fight and flight when I was a kid, did not learn about freeze. So I thought my response was completely invalid. Unfortunately, due to past experiences, having experienced sexual violence as a child, I had an ingrained response to it already at the age of 16. Despite having taken a self-defense class literally the year before, where I flipped a 250-pound guy over my back, I knew the mechanics of how to defend myself. But when it came down to it, my brain just shut down. I struggled to see through that whiteout when suddenly everything became white because my blood all rushed to my feet. I said no several times, and then my brain just sort of dissociated. I'm not sure if any of you have had this experience where, your brain just kind of goes somewhere else. You're not there. To this day, even, when I will revisit my trauma in therapy, my therapist will say to me, "Where'd you go?" So my body didn't run. My body didn't fight for my life and push him off of me. My body just kind of sat there paralyzed. Ultimately, I had little control over what my body did. I blamed myself 1,000 times, and I sat in self-loathing for just letting it happen. So here's the part where I struggled through tears and a tingling face to write. And FYI, a tingling face is one of the first symptoms of an anxiety attack for me. So when I was writing about this, I had a really hard time processing. I'm going to say now what I needed to hear when I was 16 years old to the room now. If you survived a trauma and your response to it was to freeze, it's okay. I am so sorry that you were made to endure that pain. Your response was valid and it was natural. It has no moral bearing on your character. nor any say over who you are as a human being. I hope that you get the healing that you need. I hope that you integrate the memory and that you become stronger and more compassionate because of your healing. Do not blame yourself. Do not blame yourself. Do not blame yourself. I blamed myself, not only because of my trauma response, but also because what happened to me was date rape. Even though we weren't dating at the time. We'd had a romantic relationship in the past, and I cared deeply about him. Even though I tried telling my peers about this cycle of intimate partner violence that he'd inflicted upon me, I must admit that when they doubted me, when they alienated me, I began to doubt me too. According to RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, a full 33% of sexual assault is committed by a current or former romantic partner of the victim. According to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, a full 51% of female rape victims reported being raped by an intimate partner. That's more than half. But there is a prevalent idea in our society that legitimate rape looks like being kidnapped, tied up, gagged, penetrated, and then perhaps killed by a complete stranger. Heck, there are even some conservative leaders who were perpetuating an idea that husbands could not possibly rape their wives because marriage vows constituted consent for all circumstances in perpetuity. So I doubted myself from mere days after I was raped because of my peers' response. Because I then became so convinced that because I loved him, it couldn't have been rape, even though there was nothing remotely like consent on that horrific day. Heck, I even knew a pro-life leader once who told me over a dinner table at a pro-life event that it couldn't possibly have been rape because I didn't call the cops on him, because I didn't file a police report. I didn't file a police report at 16 because not only did I care deeply about my own rapist, but I also didn't think that I'd be believed. I thought rehashing it would be traumatic, that I would be dragged through the mud as a slut and promiscuous, and that everything that I had ever worked for would be lost. I thought that because of my trauma response, I'd have a difficult time remembering things clearly. I thought that because of my trauma response in light of our past consensual history, I'd be read as a willing sexual partner by the authorities. And the thing is, not only in this instance, but every single time that I've been sexually assaulted, I've frozen, almost like a statue, unable to move. And perhaps this room will find it more horrific than most, that I was sexually violated in the Vatican when I was 21 years old. And most recently, when I was working in a Starbucks just about a year ago, I noticed that there was this guy who was sitting catty corner to me in the very back of the Starbucks. And I noticed that he had his penis out and he was masturbating at me. His hostile, power-seeking, exhibitionist behavior just caused me to have a silent anxiety attack. No one was around in the back of that Starbucks to witness the violence. Where this Starbucks was I don't know if you guys have ever been to it. It's in East Liberty in Pittsburgh. Don't go there. It's awful. There's like the front of the Starbucks where like the baristas are and the counter is, and then there's like a very tiny hallway, and then there's like a back room. And the baristas cannot see the back room from the front. So I froze as I felt my face and my limbs go numb and my mind go blank. After what seemed an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, I started to come down out of the numbness and the panic through slower breathing and grounding techniques that I was learning in therapy, and I mindlessly grabbed my phone out of habit. I felt like I was in a trance, but the words of that one pro-life leader kept echoing in my mind. I kept thinking, if I don't report this, does it mean that I want it? I did my best to take a photo to be able to report him and accidentally got a video instead. In it, I caught the profile of his face. I sat there for another couple of minutes, hoping to regain feeling in my legs to just be able to walk to the front and to be able to tell the baristas or the manager about what was going on. So I go up, I tell the manager under my breath about what was going on, and she and another barista literally run to the back of the Starbucks, trying to catch him. But he had already run out the back door and was down the sidewalk by the time they got there. The manager then sat down with me, got me a drink, and called the police to report the incident. She said that the police would be there soon, but she wasn't sure when. I waited there for over 90 minutes, shaking and crying, and dissociating and hoping that the cops would come sooner rather than later. I wanted to go home to my husband and to my dogs and just be able to cry in my own house. I couldn't wait on the cops anymore. I hadn't eaten dinner, and it didn't seem like they cared. So I left. I sent the video to the manager and hoped that they would be able to file a report. So even when I was willing to report, at age 29, it was clear to me that the system is stacked against us as victims. It's become clear to me that why only 230 instances of rape out of every 1,000 are reported. When reporting is so traumatic, fraught, and full of shame. It was obvious to me that sexual assault isn't seen as important enough for the cops to come collect a victim's report. And when it is reported, only 46 of those 230 that are submitted will ever lead to an arrest. Of those 46 arrests, only 9 cases will be referred to prosecutors. Of those 9, only 5 will ever lead to convictions. Of those 5, only 4.6 will ever be incarcerated. So if you guys got those numbers, out of every 1,000 rapes, less than 5 rapists are ever incarcerated for their crime. Granted, I'm for restorative justice models, and I'm not particularly in support of retributive justice and incarceration, but it is absolutely shameful that only 5 out of 1,000 cases of rape will ever lead to convictions. If there isn't a faith in the criminal justice system to be arbiters of justice for the offender or the offended, then it makes perfect sense why so many victims would just opt not to report. And this grave underreporting by survivors and the lack of convictions of and repercussions for rapists on college campuses has been documented time and time again. So whether you are a student or faculty member, administrator, or community member, you have the power and the responsibility to lobby your academic institutions and your local government to create and develop competent justice systems that empower survivors and hold rapists accountable for the violence that they committed. on the slide that I had up for here, there was a website that you should go to. So remember that if you're interested. Of course, this is all not even to mention the amount of shame and blame that comes with going public and reporting a case like this. I'm sure you all could see the sort of shame that came to me when I tried to open up to my friends and tell them about what had happened. I wasn't believed. They sided with my rapist. Past the shame of not being believed, though, is being blamed for what happened to me. I was sometimes subtly and sometimes openly blamed for the rape, whether or not people actually believed it was rape. Some people thought that I had been too fast and loose and I'd brought it on myself. That, by wearing immodest clothes and seeking love and affection and affirmation through sex, that I had brought the violence of rape upon myself. The blame and the shame were isolating. Not only had I felt the loss involved in trauma, but I also lost my friends and my sense of self-worth. So try to think of it this way. A little thought experiment for y'all, okay? What if, instead of violating my body through sex, my rapist had violated me by cutting one of my feet off, right? And somehow I'm able to make it work and get by, and I'm limping along, and it's uncomfortable and it's painful, but I'm surviving, right? I'm getting through. And the response of my peers somehow to my limping and my pain was simply, I don't believe you. I don't believe that this guy cut your foot off. No, you're making it up. Or some people who might say, oh, well, yeah, your foot's gone, but I think you brought this on yourself by wearing those high heels to that dance. Really, it was you who broke your foot off. After being told so many times that I wasn't actually missing a foot, I'd really begin to doubt myself, right? I'd be okay, maybe my brain is wrong, and maybe there is a foot there and I just can't see it. And I'm having phantom pains and stuff, right? So I'm not sure and I'm doubting myself, right? I'd wonder if I was insane, legitimately. Maybe they could see something that I couldn't. Maybe my band geek friends didn't want to believe that this seemingly wholesome, winsome guy could do something so horrific as cut my foot off. Maybe that was why they were blaming me and disbelieving me. Whether or not they recognized it as such, my peers were participating in my trauma further by convincing me that my own memory was unreliable. You guys ever heard of the term gaslighting? Yeah, a few of you. Okay. So as a survivor myself, probably the number one takeaway that I want you to learn from this talk is this. Believe survivors. Don't gaslight them, please. Looking back on it now, I can see how not being believed and being blamed for this violence against me re-traumatized me over and over again. Heck, not being believed about things now at age 30 and a whole 14 years after the incident still gives me trauma echoes and sends me back to that awful moment on my front porch. So think about what sorts of things you are saying to those who have survived sexual violence that might indicate to them or others that you blame them for the violence that they suffered through. Think about what you do or you say that might indicate that you don't really believe survivors and their accounts of sexual violence. Before you talk to someone who suffered sexual violence, stop and think. And please, for the love of all that is good, never ever tell a survivor of sexual violence that everything happens for a reason. I can't tell you how many times I've heard something like that, thrown out as a cheesy platitude, meant to fill dead air and awkward silence. It's okay to say, that's awful, or I'm so sorry that happened to you, and to sit in that awkward silence, pregnant with pain and grief and anger. But don't try to fill the space with platitudes and cutesy phrases. Doing so minimizes the feelings of victims and can be a subtle form of emotional neglect. Now, I want to cover one last topic related to sexual violence that is so very near and dear to my heart. What our response should be to a conception after rape. Number 1, always acknowledge and respond to the pain with compassion first. Acknowledge the horror of rape. Acknowledge what the victim is going through and how scared they might feel. Acknowledge how raw their feelings might be. Secondly, we should seek to get them the physical and mental health care that will help them to heal. As you heard from my story, you can sort of glean that I think that abortion after rape conception is just a recipe for compounding trauma and violence upon trauma and violence. It is oppression passed on to an innocent human being. It is dehumanization continued. Not only would the victim of the rape, the survivor of the rape, potentially suffer the effects of post-traumatic stress because of the rape, but they would also be more likely to suffer from the effects of perpetration-induced traumatic stress because they took part in inflicting violence upon their own preborn child. And interestingly, there have been studies done that demonstrate that rape victim mothers are more likely to choose life for their children than the general population. I believe it's because we can more clearly see how the child in the womb is vulnerable to violence, just like we were as rape victims. There is an intimate and unbreakable connection there, a sort of kinship, a bond, in being unwilling to pass on more violence and to subject another human to trauma like we suffered. Instead of the violence of abortion, rape victims need real help. So she needs to be protected by ensuring that the rapist does not have parental rights. There are still states in this nation where rapists can sue for parental rights of the children that they donated sperm to during the rape. And we need to make sure that the rape victim mother will be able to receive governmental aid even if she is unable to name who the rapist is. Because in a lot of states, in a lot of places, you still have to name the father in order to get governmental aid. Tragically, the rhetoric surrounding abortion has left the majority of rape victim mothers unprotected because too many seem to think that a real rape victim couldn't possibly want her child, when this is simply untrue. So I will work to protect rape victims and their children, both born and preborn, because I know that violence is not the answer to crisis. So I will work passionately for a world where we have authentic, human-centered reproductive justice that stands for the rights and dignity of all. I hope that you will work alongside me, like literally every single one of you. Be honored to have you walk with me, to build a world that is free from violence. I want you to walk with me to build a world that is safe and compassionate and life-affirming for survivors. Let's work together to end rape culture and uphold human dignity. Let's work passionately for a world without rape and all forms of sexual violence. And let us proclaim together that freedom from violence for ourselves and our children is reproductive justice. Thank you.